Hey everybody, CVH here, and in today's video we're going to be taking an introductory look at the different styles of decks you'll encounter in Elder Scrolls Legends. These can typically be broken down into three general categories: aggro, midrange, and control. If you're a longtime card game player, a lot of this is probably going to seem like common knowledge, but I thought this was an important topic to go over because as a new player, when starting out, one of the most important things to consider in deck building is your game plan. A lot of first-time players have a hard time identifying this plan, and as a result, when they ask for advice on their decks or they share their list, a lot of them just kind of seem all over the place. As a new player, it can be really tempting to simply try to identify all the best cards you have in your growing collection and just play them all, but having an idea of how you want your games to go and focusing on that in the deck building stage is going to lead to a lot more wins in the long run. So let's cover the outlines of these three main styles of decks, starting with aggro. Aggro decks are going to be the fastest decks you'll encounter in Legends. The win condition of the game is, of course, to reduce your opponent's life total from 30 to 0, and one could just say aggro decks are the style of deck most aware of that win condition. Aggro decks will be looking to rush opponents down with an onslaught of early game creatures and supplemented by damage dealing actions or support cards, just attempting to end the game as quickly as turns 4 or 5 in the best case scenarios. The creatures, however, are not going to be very resilient or good at trading with other creatures, but none of that matters if you can close the game quickly enough. If the game does go long, however, the lower card quality can make it very difficult to take back a lost board if the early aggression has been stopped. Occasionally, the aggro deck will have to make a call to not destroy a room with an attack, holding back damage, or trade with a creature instead of hitting the face. These decisions are usually just made when they increase the likelihood of long-term damage output by either preventing your opponent from trading with one of your high-value attackers or preventing opponents from effectively racing you. So what do these aggro decks usually look like? Well, let's go over some examples. This is an aggro battle mage deck, and I'll also be showcasing an orc warrior deck, and it's important to note that these decks may or may not be viable depending on the time you're watching this video, but they do show the typical trends aggro decks have. Both of these decks do use red strength, which is very common in aggro decks due to the attributes cards being naturally inclined towards aggression. That said, aggro decks can theoretically be made with any class. Notice that the Magicka curve down here heavily emphasizes the first few turns of the game. Aggro decks never want to miss a turn 2 creature and would ideally like to start developing on the board on turn 1 with or without the Ring of Magicka. Speaking of the ring, aggro decks will want to use the ring fairly aggressively should they go second in a game, bringing out creatures for the first few turns early to put themselves as far ahead in those early turns as possible. Much like the deck's overall card quality, the ring also loses a lot of value in the later stages of the game in an aggro deck, since the deck will naturally be slowly running out of cards and can likely play whatever it draws naturally as a top deck in those later turns. The creatures in an aggro deck are not designed for durability, although it's nice if they can live for a few turns so they can deal the most amount of damage possible. The few actions in the deck, as we saw in the Battle Mage deck particularly, will likely be there to help the creatures deal the most damage they can while they are alive, because once the board is lost, it tends to stay that way. Most actions and supports in aggro decks will also be great at dealing damage themselves, giving the deck some additional reach from hand. Charge creatures like Cliff Racer also provide this ability to kill opponents, even after they've removed your board. Even the prophecies in aggro decks are primarily offensive, with their main purpose being to give you free creatures to attack with should an aggressive opponent attempt to race, or even a control player start trying to kill you over a number of turns, or even use drain creatures on your face. At the top end of the curve, there are typically some ways to sustain the aggression should the game go late, such as Triumphant Jarl or a couple mid-game finishers, but not much space in the deck is allocated for this kind of thing. That said, cards like Jarl can allow you to maintain some amount of pressure and find those last points of damage, and that can be critical against control decks. So that's basically it for the basics of aggro, and on the opposite end of the spectrum, we'll skip over to control decks. These decks play the exact opposite role as an aggro deck, and attempt to slow the game down and win the long game instead of the short game. In the early turns, these decks will be aiming to play very defensively and react to what the opponent is doing. This means taking favorable trades with smaller creatures when available, using removal and guards to deal with early aggression, and being very, very cautious when attacking the opponent directly. Frequently, Frequently, you'll see control players not attacking at all during the majority of the game so as not to accidentally get the opponent close to the destruction of a rune, minding their own cards with Drain or Breakthrough as well, so when you have to attack face with those, you don't break an additional rune if you don't have to. In a control mirror match situation, one control player will often try to become the aggressor and beat down the opponent, and this will often happen to some success, but the ideal win condition for these control decks is going to be to bury the opponent in card advantage and starve them on resources and creatures, and then try to end the game in a single turn or a couple of turns. So again, I have some samples on the screen for you to go through while we continue talking, and keep in mind, these are just showing some trends and not necessarily optimized, or even relevant if you're watching this video at a later date. But while aggro decks care about raw damage output and taking the board early, control decks are much more about winning through card advantage, and run many cards that further that objective. This means finding efficient ways to remove opposing creatures, cards that keep the control player's hand full, and making plays that are designed to lose your opponent more cards than you do. More aggressive strategies will often sacrifice this card advantage to further their aggressive goal, but in control mirror matches, it can lead to some very drawn-out situations where both players are fighting for every small bit of advantage they can find. As you can see, these decks look quite different from aggro decks. There's a heavy emphasis on the late game in the Magicka curve with fewer early game options. The early game options that are there are much less offensive and more about just trying to survive against aggressive decks. The prophecy cards in these decks also serve a primarily defensive role, and there are ample guards, removal in the form of actions and creatures like Manticore and Ice Storm, and healing effects to stabilize against these more aggressive strategies. Whereas aggro decks are typically relatively cheap to build, control decks can also tend to be on the expensive side due to the higher rarity of many of these late game bombs and value-oriented cards. So now that we've talked about some of the most aggressive decks you'll see and some of the slowest decks you'll see, let's sort of take a trip to the middle of the road and talk about mid-range decks. They sit somewhere in the middle, and while they are primarily aggressive decks, they do tend to play different roles depending on the matchup. Instead of raw speed like aggro decks, mid-range decks have a higher threat density, which tends to scale upward as the game goes longer. Aggro decks are likely to run out of steam at a certain point, but these mid-range decks can make much more powerful plays on turns 6 through 9 and win a lot of games through opponents not being able to answer the constant stream of threatening creatures. Against faster aggro decks, the mid-range decks tend to play a more defensive role early on since they would lose an outright race the majority of the time. These decks tend to play very few powerful removal options and are much lighter on healing effects and guards than the average control deck, so this can be pretty tricky. If the mid-range deck can take the board, however, it can then start winning with its more powerful creatures. Against control, the game plan is a lot more linear, and it can just act as an aggro deck that may be a little slower to get off the ground. The game plan against slower decks or decks of relatively similar speed is often to try to be the proactive player and keep the tempo throughout the entire game, forcing the opponent to answer early pressure and capitalizing on that situation by playing threatening cards even in the later turns to help close the game. In these mid-range decks, we can see that there are enough early game options to get on the board quickly in the first 2 turns of the game. Even these early game creatures can be tricky to deal with, like Windkeep's Spellsword, or have a lot of snowball potential like Daring Cutpurse or Goblin Skulk in the Archer list we featured. Specific card choices in all of these decks come down to metagaming, but there are often a few tools at least to deal with the faster decks as well, such as Skaven Pyromancer or the Curse package or Firebolts. The curve is more well-rounded than aggro decks after that point, as you can see, and you'll notice slower but more threatening creatures starting to appear at the magic costs of 5 and above. These allow the mid-range deck to curve out deeper into a game than a faster deck, sacrificing some speed for raw power and value options to play that longer game. And that's pretty much all you need to know about the basics of aggro, control, and mid-range decks, which basically form the backbone of everything you'll be seeing on the Elder Scrolls Legends ladder. There are definitely some decks that can sort of fit hybrid roles. You'll notice some aggro, control, tempo strategies, combo decks. There are a lot of crazy decks out there, but these are the basics and probably the essentials of what you'll need when you're building your first deck. I would definitely recommend trying to stick to one of these plans and really focusing on that in your deck building. It should lead to a lot more consistency in your games. As far as the actual matchup trends are concerned, a lot of that does depend on the specific deck lists themselves. Typically though, It goes a little bit like this. Aggro decks have the ability to get under the similarly aggressive but slower mid-range strategies and just simply outrace them on damage, but they do find themselves outclassed by control decks, especially in the later stages of the game, if the control player can stabilize against the early aggression. Like we mentioned, the control player has a deck that's filled to the brim with tools that are capable of doing just that. So using a recent example from the current metagame that we're playing in when I'm recording this video as an example, the Aggro Prophecy Battle Mage deck that I went over in the video would then be very favored against the mid-range Sorcerer deck we looked at, but quite unfavored against the Control Mage or the Control Monk deck we looked at. Similarly, if you're playing a mid-range deck, you have a strong game against slower decks, since like we mentioned, you're a bit slower than an aggro deck, but control decks are going to have a hard time dealing with your threat output in the later turns of the game, or the mid-game turns we should call it. That's why it's a mid-range deck. But if you are a mid-range deck playing against an aggro deck, the speed of an aggro deck is going to be a problem. And to round things out, if you're a control player, you should be able to have a deck with enough early game defensive tools to stabilize against aggro, and as soon as the game goes late, you become incredibly favored. But if you're up against a mid-range deck, there are definitely some mid-range decks that are lighter on threats that are easier to stabilize against, but depending on the build, you're probably going to be more unfavored than not. Of course, like I mentioned, these rules definitely are not set in stone, so I wouldn't freak out about them. Metagame trends, tech cards, and of course the element of chance also play very large roles in deciding games of any given card game. No different here, but hopefully this sort of analysis and the breakdown of the different decks has helped you to some degree, especially if you're new to the game, made it seem a little bit less daunting. I know it can be a little intimidating to go to a stream or go to watch videos or look at the meta snapshot even and see all these different terms and not really know how to identify what you're looking at. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a like, feel free to subscribe to the channel for more strategy content, gameplay videos, deck techs, discussion videos like this, all of that good stuff. Feel free to follow my stream in the description in the link. I do stream Elder Scrolls daily, so hopefully I get to catch you there, and I'll see you guys next time.